Hello, and welcome to another conversation with Carl. Please remember to like, follow, and subscribe for the latest content. Today, I am excited to welcome Professor Phil Brown, Distinguished Professor of Sociology and Health Science at Northeastern University. Professor Brown is the co-founder and president of the Catskills Institute, a historical preservation society, and the author of Catskills Culture and Mountain Rats Memories of the Great Jewish Resort Area. Welcome, Professor Phil Brown. Thank you so much for joining me. I want to start with, for many older East Coast American Jews, the Catskills immediately conjure up memories of comfort, relaxation, comedy, and massive quantities of food. Can you give us a glimpse into why the Catskills specifically became a refuge for American Jews? And did this mostly start after World War II?
She started earlier. The first Jewish boarding house was in the 1890s, probably around 1893. And the other is the Catskills were pretty crowded with people way before World War II. The golden age, as we talked about, but it was a really great area for just probably 500,000 people a year would go up there in the golden age. And you had an enormous number of Protestant bungalow colonies and a resort area that was for Jews. It was really a paradise because they couldn't go anywhere. There were so many restricted places that were not allowing Jews in. And all of a sudden you had your choice, of small, medium, large hotel or bungalow colony or boarding house, and so many different locations. You could play around with, people that you knew from your neighborhood back in New York City, key brothers working in the dining room. You could have all sorts of community up there. And basically just an enormous amount of Yiddishkeit, of Jewish culture that was endless across half of Sullivan County and a large chunk of Ulster County. So it was very unique in being so large and being so thoroughly Jewish, and eventually developed a Jewish year-round population too. So there were shuls and there were businesses and all kinds of places that really could support.
Was it a religious crowd, or was it mostly secular, or was it a mix of everybody?
Well, it was a mix in the sense that very few places were religious per se. There were a handful of Orthodox places, mainly modern Orthodox. People walked into the dining room on Friday night and there was challah and wine. There was a table out in front of the dining room. You could light candles before you went in. Services at some places. And even places that were not religious might even have their own prayer books. And Grossingers put out a prayer book for people in case they did want to have prayers at dinner or other times. And there were services. Some hotels really did have a regular routine of services, even though most people did not go to them. But the culture was definitely a very Jewish in a way that was still Jewish. So they shared a lot of the kinds of entertainment and culture and card games and music that the rest of the society was doing, but they also pioneered some very important Yiddish types as well. So they brought up Second Avenue Yiddish vaudeville theater type culture there as well. And that was the birth really of American Jewish comedy.
So, you talked about Grossingers, and that's the most iconic, I think, hotel in the area. Give us a little insight into this property's history.
Well, it's an interesting time right now because Elaine Grossinger Edis, who was the granddaughter of the founders, died. But the funeral passed 92nd Street Y this last week, and I did a memorial note for her, as well as for Neil Sedaka, who was an important Catskills singer, and his family owned a hotel. Selig and Malka Grossinger came over, set up a little farmhouse, and when you see pictures of it, it looks like it's just big enough for a family of maybe 6 people, and it just grew over time. And then when their daughter Jenny took it over, she was really the quintessential person who built it into a very large resort. And it was second only in size to the Concord, but very cultured in a different way. So it had more of an old-time Hamish feeling to it. The buildings were more traditional as well as modern, whereas the Concord looked like, a high-rise had just been built from New York City and put up in the Catskills. It never looked like an old Catskills hotel. But Grossingers, you still had the original buildings, even though they were new ones. They had a very interesting culture of bringing up. They trained a lot of boxers there for fights. They had a lot of celebrities, a lot of politicians come through there. So it was, I think, more of a friendly culture. Of course, it's not here anymore. They went out of business and nothing got rebuilt there, even though there were plans at times to do it. But they had their own airport. They had probably the first ski slope of any Catskills hotel, and it's a very enormous place and very well known. My own experience in the Catskills was began there owning a small hotel, and after they lost that, they worked in small hotels, and I did for the most part as well. But I do remember my college girlfriend came up to visit me, her first year of college, and her family was staying at Grossinger's, and I got invited to join them for dinner. So I was able to get somebody to take over my job for the one night, and it was the only time I ever ate in the main dining room as a guest. And I can attest it was a beautiful, luxurious place. But what's also important about Grossinger's is that Jenny and then later her daughter Elaine carried on as very great ambassadors to this culture, and they were interviewed all over the place. Up until the time she died, Elaine Grossinger Edis was always talking about the hotel and what it meant to Jewish life. She and I actually helped put together a month-long event at the Jewish Community Center in Boca Raton. And I gave a keynote address. She introduced me there. I gave another talk. I helped them get other speakers. They showed every film that was ever made about the Catskills, whether a documentary or a feature film. They had an enormous exhibit of artwork and postcards and tchotchkes from the hotels, many speakers of all sorts, and just a wonderful gathering that literally went on for a month. I have very fond memories of Elaine and her legacy that way. She really promoted the Catskills until her last year.
When we speak of the Catskills, it's 100% synonymous with the Borscht Belt. Many big names in comedy started in the Catskill resorts. Can you give us into the history of the Borscht Belt and some of the big names who performed there?
Important entertainers, certainly in the Jewish world, was there. I mean, you can think of Jerry Lewis, of course, whose relatives owned the Browns Hotel in Loch Sheldrake, and they named the nightclub after him. Sam Levinson started out there. And the smallest of places had what was called the Tumler, and the Tumlers, often became, very important artists. You had singers like the Barry sisters, and in later years, you actually had a lot of rock and roll shows. So it wasn't just traditional singers and comics, but Jay and the Americans sang up there. And the hotels by the late 60s and early 70s were starting to do this more because they needed to get a younger crowd in and replace some of the older people who were dying off or who were going to other places. But, Billy Crystal, of course, is somebody that we all know of, and he actually, in his Mr. Saturday Night, shows us a bit of his entertainment life up there.
Mel Brooks also
Mel
talks
Brooks,
about,
of course, yes.
he talks about how he worked at one of the resorts and he jokes about how all he had to do was fill tubs of sour cream on the people's plates. And he would go back and forth. And it always cracks me up when you hear Mel Brooks talking about all they wanted was sour cream.
Well, this is, the kind of classic Tumler act. If you see the film Sweet Lorraine, you see Freddie Roman, who died a couple of years ago, who had in later years developed a kind of entertainment trio called Catskills on Broadway. He and another singer and another comic did this show all over the place, and it was also turned into a film. Freddie Roman plays, in his dining room, just sort of making funny gestures and making up songs and just sort of tumbling with the people. And it's just a very common kind of thing there. So you made fun of the food, you made fun of the guests, you made fun of the owners, and it was all in good spirit. So it's like one endless roast.
Talk about food, because food seems it was so integral and important to this. And you just talked about going to Grossinger's dining hall for one time and you have fond memories of sitting there. How did food play a role?
It's very important. I mean, if you think about the origins of most of the early Catskills, it's Jewish farmers who were primarily dairy farmers and egg farmers. And Sullivan County was actually the biggest egg farming county in the entire state of New York. And there was a lot of money put in by wealthy philanthropists, Baron de Hirsch, and they had the whole Jewish Agricultural Society to help these people do farms. And the farmers then started to take in boarders because there wasn't enough money to get the farm. And food was important because it was there, it was home grown, and it was fresh, and it was delicious, and it was like your mother used to make and your grandmother used to make. So I remember one of the owners of the Brickman's Hotel in an interview many, many years ago said, you came up here, it was like home. We fed you because we had the cows, we made the cream, we made the milk, we made the butter. You didn't come to a hotel, you came to our house. And that was the sense. Even when the hotels became larger, they sort of still kept up that feeling. And they may have stopped also having their own cows on the premises, but they really did take food very seriously. And this was really the origin of the week vacation, where you got 3 meals a day, along with all the entertainment and all of the other things that came with the hotel. So food was very served lavishly, as much as you wanted, and people ate a lot. They ate, primarily Jewish specialties with an occasional nod to other cultures, some Chinese food, but it was not very common. Certainly some Italian food, but, very, very Jewish food, and very, very wide selection. When you look at the menus, you're amazed at how much they had to have in stock all the time just to satisfy people. And there were, of course, endless jokes about how much people ate.
Were these places affordable to most people, or was it exclusively for upper class?
That's the thing about it. It's affordable to everybody. Let's say in the early 70s, you could spend $1,000 for an entire summer at a bungalow colony. And that would be a good bungalow colony too. So when you think about this, it's almost 10 weeks, like $100 a week to have a whole place. Then you have to buy your own food and cook it in the bungalow colony. But hotels might be, in the 1950s as low as, $30, $40 a week, everything included. So it was affordable. If you didn't have a lot of money, you went to a smaller hotel. If you had a lot, you went to the bigger one. And some people would splurge and they would just go up there, even if it was just for a weekend. Just to say, I went to Grossinger's, I went to the Concord, I went to Neverly. It was a big deal. When you look at the guests who were there, you could see the kinds of jobs they had. Many of them were teachers, they were store clerks, they were furriers, they worked in a garment district. A lot of working class Jews up there, and that's what made it also a very interesting place, because you had enormous amounts of variation. My friend Erwin Richmond, who wrote a book called Bungalow, talked very much about this. He said people used to think the bungalows were only for the people who didn't have money, and the hotels were for the people that had money. He said, but I'll tell you a story, about this bungalow colony with this very wealthy person who's, the next bungalow over is somebody who just a store clerk. And he just liked that culture. He liked the community of being there for the whole summer with the same people and sharing, playing together with their kids and having a daily softball game and everything else. So there was a mixture of classes there. Usually it was pretty affordable to the average working class Jew.
Let's move on to Dirty Dancing, which depicts the Catskills resort from the 1960s. I don't even think they mention the word Jewish in the whole movie, and I might be wrong on that one.
You're right. I mean, all of us who know the Catskills found this to be a very difficult movie to deal with, because on the one hand, it created a lot of interest in Catskills, especially the entertainment world of the Catskills. But it also, as you say, it was de-Judaized. You look at the people and they're Jewish, right? Jennifer Grey looks Jewish, but no one ever talks about being Jewish. Not a Yiddish word mentioned there. There's nothing at all. And so it's very inauthentic as a film all around. It just doesn't really portray hotel life. The most authentic part is at the end, when they're having the staff and guest talent show, which a lot of hotels had. Typically, this would not be at a big hotel like Grossinger's, but at smaller places. But that is a really good clip of that show. And that's when you see Jennifer Grey dancing with Johnny and saying to everybody, forget it. We're just going to be who we are. So it did create a lot of interest, but it did not feel authentic to anybody. There are two movies that were incredibly authentic. One of them being A Walk on the Moon, which was about bungalow colonies. A beautiful film that stars Viggo Mortensen and Diane Lane. In fact, was probably what made their careers. It's totally authentic and beautiful. And it's actually being made into a Broadway play now. And then the other was Sweet Lorraine, I mentioned, that was where Freddie Roman does the cameo as a similar. Maureen Stapleton is the star of that. She's the hotel owner. Maureen Stapleton, who is not Jewish, is more Jewish and sounds more Jewish than anybody in Dirty Dancing. So these are the two films I would, suggest anybody watch if they wanted to get a taste of what daily life was like for the guests, the owners, and the workers in those hotels in Colin.
Well, I've had discussions with friends before if Dirty Dancing's a Jewish movie or not. So it's really interesting to get your perspective on that.
Mhm.
At the end of Dirty Dancing, Max, who's the hotel owner, he comments that kids are no longer interested in accompanying families
Yeah.
to these resorts. They want fancier vacations. Would you say that was like in the 60s when the movie takes place is actually the start of the decline of the Catskills?
Well, it's true. I mean, that's when you begin to see the decline. Some of the larger hotels did survive into the 70s and some even later. But the smaller ones had a much harder time of it. But when you look at people writing about the Catskills, you can go back to the 90s and people saying, oh, we're on the decline, even though they weren't. But what happened, you take the average small hotel that was built in the 20s, because once the Depression comes, they aren't building new hotels and they aren't renovating them. So most of the renovation comes after the war, and some hotels can afford to do it and to build more rooms, to build an indoor swimming pool on top of the outdoor pool, to have a bigger nightclub, and to have just golf courses and ski slopes and whatever other amenities they could have. By this time, people did not want to share bathrooms. In small hotels, for the most part, I would say the bulk of the rooms were sharing a bath. I don't mean two rooms sharing a bath. I mean, you would have like 10 or 15 rooms on the floor sharing a couple of bathrooms and a shower. And so in your
Wow.
room, you had a sink, but that's all. But all the rest of the facilities were shared. People didn't want this anymore. Also, by the end of the war, people were seeing a lot more end of exclusion of discrimination against Jews. They were seeing an expansion of Jewish life to Florida, the Los Angeles. Deborah Dash Moore, who's an historian who was one of our board members of the Catskills Institute, wrote a book, an entire book about this. And she talked about these as the golden cities that Jews were going to and having a permanent vacation in the sun. Did they need to go to the Catskills anymore? By the 1960s, kids of the people who've been going to the Catskills are in college and they're going to Europe for the summer. Jews going back to Europe after the Holocaust, was not possible in 1948 or 1952. By the 60s, when their kids are going back, Europe seems like a safe place. So we have now traveled to Europe. We have the growth of cruise lines, which then mirror the all-inclusive vacation that the Catskills started. And we have also a decline in people wanting to only be in a kosher hotel or to be in a place that's all Jewish. And the little hotels had not renovated, they hadn't expanded, they couldn't afford this. Labor costs went up, food costs went up, and people had a much wider variety. If you start beginning of the 1960s, almost every Jew married another Jew. By the end of the 60s, we're about 50% into marriage. And it may be uncomfortable for an intermarried family to be in this very Jewish environment. Also, there was a lot of upward mobility for Jews, and they didn't have to go work there. And so if you didn't work there, you didn't then go back 10 years later with your family as a guest. It was no longer an important part of your life. And as Jews became doctors and lawyers and business people and much more affluent, they didn't need to work their way through college or graduate school in the summer.
I recently saw the comedian Modi perform, and he's 56, and he tells when he started out in 1995, being one of the last people of his generation to perform at the Catskills. Even though the decline might have started when we were just talking about in the 60s, it took a while for the last lights to be turned off. Was there special resilience that kept these places going into the 90s? The Neverly doesn't closed in 2009. Butcher's does not shut its doors until 2014. Was there something that kept these places still going?
But there was, because people really were very attached to this. When I have the term mountain rats as part of the title of my book, we were mountain rats. We were drawn to this place. We couldn't stop going back. And if we were hotel owners, we couldn't give it up. I became friendly with many older people. When I started to work on the history of the Catskills in the 90s, I was meeting people who I had known or who knew me as an infant, who knew my parents. I had kind of almost got a whole adopted set of them. I became friendly with Carrie Canito. She owned the Aladdin Hotel in Woodburn. Not exactly small, maybe closer to medium size. Maybe, they could have 200, 225 guests there. Then she was in her 90s. She was schlepping cots to rooms. The guests said, I got my kid coming up and there's not enough room. I need another cot. And this is a woman who's not even 5 feet tall. And she's been resilient. She's been surviving this very hard life, working 7 days a week all the time, from early morning to late at night. She's tough. She's just been able to keep doing this because she loves it. It's in her blood and it's all she wants to do. So a lot of hotel owners will like that. They want you to hold on. Often their kids did not. I mentioned Rickens before. Patty Posner, who's about my age, decided to take it over from her family. And she loved running the hotel. Another friend, Jerry Jacobs, my age, like me, a sociologist, who his parents said, look, Jerry, congratulations, you got your doctorate finally. You're going to now come work in the hotel. He said, that's why I got my doctorate. I don't want to work in the hotel anymore. So you had a difference there. But, there were some people who wanted to keep going, and they felt this was their life, this was their friends. They had been there, not just their whole lives, but their parents before them had been the hotel owners, sometimes their grandparents. They felt tied. They had been the founders of the local shul. They had been supporters of local businesses. They were sometimes members of town councils. They might have been, police chiefs. They have all kinds of ties to the place, and they wanted to keep it going as much as they could.
In retrospect, could have been a way to save the Catskills?
No, it was such a unique place. There's nothing like it since either. I mean, you could say that you go to a big resort section of another country or somewhere in this country, that you can have endless rows of hotels down the beach. Each of them sort of stands on its own. There's really no shared culture. And the shared culture of the Catskills was very, very important there. And it was a linesman kind of culture. It's people who knew each other, if not from the old country, from their neighborhoods back in mainly New York City and other places surrounding New York. But you couldn't really recreate it because people were changing. They were moving up in the world. They were moving away from New York. They weren't getting married and living in the same neighborhood as they had grown up in. They were going to other cities. They couldn't just take a quick drive up Route 17 to go to the Catskills. And that plus all the other reasons I mentioned, different kinds of resorts, assimilation, affluence, it just couldn't have been saved.
But there's no other place in America where American Jews, like living in the Midwest and the West Coast, could vacation, like the East Coast Jews could also always go up to the Catskills. There's no place in the rest of America, right?
No, I mean, there were one or two hotels of that type in the Midwest, near Chicago, near Detroit. There were a couple in Canada. If you ever see the film The Adventures of Judy Kravitz, they show you some resorts up there, a small culture of them. There were a handful of Jewish resorts in Nudist, Connecticut, a handful in New Jersey, but nothing as broad and as extensive as Catskill. And it just kind of kept growing on its own and became so big that you couldn't imagine anything ever looking like that.
Yeah.
So there were no other Jewish resorts of that type anywhere else.
And if you're interested in reading more about the Catskills, you've got your book that you authored, Catskill Culture, Mountains, Rats, Memories of the Great Jewish Resort Area. And you also edited In the Catskills. And you mentioned a couple of movies. What else would you suggest?
In the Mountains is a nice collection because it's got excerpts from almost anybody who wrote about the Catskills, going all the way back to Abe Kahan, the founder of the Forward, who wrote The Rise of David Levitsky. It's got fiction and nonfiction of all sorts. And then I did another collection with a colleague called Summer Haven, The Catskills, the Holocaust, and Literary Imagination. And we talked about the Catskills during and after the Holocaust and what people were experiencing there. And it was a wonderful thing to put that together as well. My book, certainly, I mentioned Erwin Ridgman's book, Borscht Belt Bungalows. On our Catskills Institute website, which is hosted at Northeastern University, you have a thing called the Book Corner that has blurbs on a lot of books about the Catskills, and also has a lot of original writing, memoirs and short stories, other things of that sort. I mentioned those two films that are very important, Sweet Lorraine and Walk on the Moon. There is now a Borscht Belt Museum in Ellenville that does a lot of nice programming. There's a thing called the Borscht Belt Historical Marker Project. And it's a Scheinfeld to put together where they've been putting up markers all throughout the Catskills to show you where things were. And they have their own website as well that goes into greater depth and we put on a highway marker. So there's a lot of attention now and a lot of places to learn. about the Catskills.
And then there's also a television script series in development called The Mountains. Do you know anything about that? And if you,
Just that it's in development. I'll
uh,
be eager to see it. There's another wonderful film I would recommend called Four Seasons Lodge about a bungalow colony completely run by survivors of the Holocaust. And they took over an existing bungalow colony that had gone broke because while they had known each other colonies felt they couldn't be around other people who didn't share that experience. And Andrew Jacobs, who was a longtime writer for the New York Times, and also very involved in the Borscht Belt Museum that I mentioned, directed this film. It's an exquisite portrayal of their life and what they were trying to do there and what happened to them. They finally can't keep it up anymore because they're too old and they have to sell it. It's just a very, very beautiful film that tells an important slice of Catskills life too. So you can learn a lot from that one.
and as we wrap up, is there any question that I should have asked you that I did not ask you?
There are so many questions about the Catskills. There are questions about romance. There are questions about what its legacy is, what the literature about the Catskills is about. But you touched on enough things.
Phil Brown, thank you so much for joining me. The book is Catskills Culture and Mountain Rats Memories of the Great Jewish Resort Area. You can get that where you get your books. Also, everyone out there, thank you for listening. Let me know what you think. Put your thoughts in the comment section as always. And until next time, everyone, be safe.